Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Greatest Games podcast on the Blizzard. My name is Marcus Spurler. With me is Jonathan Wilson. And with us today is David Owen, a freelance sports journalist and author and former sports editor of the Financial Times. David, pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thanks, Marcus. Good to be here.
Today we go all the way back to August 1925 for the season opener at Villa Park that finished Aston Villa 10, Burnley 0. David, why have you chosen this game?
I've chosen this game because 25-26 was the season when they finally decided to change the offside law to more or less what it is now, i.e. you need two opponents between you and the goal at the moment the ball is past you. Prior to the 25-26 season, you needed three defenders, including the goalkeeper, between you and the goal. So this was a big change. They'd been sort of humming and hawing about it. I'm sure Jonathan will tell you, for at least 10 years before that. And they finally bit the bullet and did it. Now, this game occurred on the first weekend of that season. It was one of the full schedule that weekend. And you can imagine the administrators would have been curious, a little nervous, thinking what was going to happen, because the press beforehand was full of predictions about absolute avalanches of goals, and this is going to happen, that's going to happen, and this was a game that sort of is the first game with an extraordinary scoreline of a season of extraordinary scorelines. There ended up being 43% more goals scored that season than the previous season. So you can see the effect that the change in the law had. And this game was really the first one to give you an indication of the way things were going to be.
I mean, presumably, Jonathan, word hadn't reached Burnley that there was a rule change.
Well, I think it wasn't just Burnley, to be fair to them. I mean, you see some really random results beginning of that season as teams are trying to adapt. And basically, it's I think it's the biggest single law change that we've had. Other than, the laws first drawn up as we would accept them today in 1863. So in 1866 is the first really big change to offside. So previously, you hadn't been allowed to pass to somebody in front of you. So the same as rugby. And then they introduced the Eton offside law, which is this 3 men to play you on. And so post that, I think this is the single biggest change in football, bigger than the back pass law. Maybe you could say goalkeepers being restricted to handling in their box rather than their own half, which happened in 1912. But this is a massive change, and teams really struggle to deal with it. And so you see huge fluctuations. The teams will win 8-0 one week and lose 6-0 the next week. And there's no sort of consistency. And it's only really by the end of a decade that people have fully worked out how they're going to adapt to this.
I mean, David, was football particularly cagey before 1925? Was there a lack of goals and a perceived lack of entertainment? Was that why?
It was getting increasingly cagey, I think. You tended to have play compressed in midfield. And the other thing that was worrying them was attendances were dropping. You get sort of, 20 or 30 offside decisions in a game routinely. So every 3 or 4 minutes there'd be an offside decision. And crowds were going down, partly because, the economy was not great. This was 26 was the year of the general strike. But partly because the entertainment value was dropping. I think that's right, Jonathan, isn't it?
Yeah, and so in the previous season, so 24-5, which is what forces them into the change, there was an average of 2.58 goals per game, which in the 80s would have seemed pretty standard. But I mean, these days we would expect 2.7, 2.8 goals per game. And certainly by the standards of early football, 2.58 was impossibly low. So there was definitely concern about that. And the story goes that the game that really persuaded the FA, we've got to do something, was a 0-0 draw in February 25 between Bury and Newcastle. And it was Newcastle's 6th 0-0 of the season. And they had a pair of fullbacks, Hudspeth and McCracken, who was seen as being the absolute masters of playing an offside trap. And I think the offside trap in those days, it was never the risk that it is today, because of course you can leave one fullback back. So one fullback steps up, one sits in. So even if you misjudge it, you still have a fullback and the goalkeeper.
That's right.
To give you a bit of protection.
Policy. Yeah.
So it wasn't like today where you can squeeze. Even a team was squeezing up well. Even Arsenal in their pomp in the late 80s, early 90s, there was always that chance you might time the through ball and time the run, and you might get in behind them. Well, that wasn't really here then. So I think teams playing the offside trap really was killing the game. It was Notts County who really began that, but it was Newcastle who perfected it. And so I guess then the next question is, why then? Why does this has been implicit in the laws since 1866. Why is it only in the years immediately after the First World War that this happens? And my suspicion is that the war changes everything. Because even though from the 1880s football has been a professional game, the people running the teams, the directors, the secretary managers as they were, still tended to be people coming from the old middle-class university traditions. And they had this idea of playing the game the right way. And that would not mean playing an offside trap. But what the First World War does, I mean, it kills a greater proportion of the officer class than the privates class, which creates opportunities for intelligent working class people to move into managerial roles. But B, during the war, a lot of working class people get managerial experience. So the great example of this is Herbert Chapman, who I'm sure we'll go on to talk about, because he is the greatest exponent of a change in the offside law. But he'd been manager of Leeds City before. He managed Northampton, then Leeds City before the war starts. Then during the war, he leaves his job at Leeds City, which is just as well for him because they end up getting done over illegal payments and run down. And he's banned, but gets his ban lifted on the grounds he wasn't there. And the reason he's not there is because he's gone to run an armament factory in Leeds. And so he comes out of the war and is offered a job at Huddersfield. And part of the reason they want him is that they know he's a smart man in terms of tactics, in terms of dealing with players, because they've seen that at Northampton and Leeds City. But also, he's had this experience running an armaments factory. He can handle employees, he can handle money. And before the war, that experience wasn't there. So you have a different class of people running football clubs. And this class of people don't care about playing the game the right way, in inverted commas. They care about winning. Because if they don't win, they don't get the win bonus. And they need the win bonus to put food on the table, to buy shoes for their kids, whatever. So I think that's why football becomes much more win-focused, shall we say, immediately after the First World War. But that then leads to goals per game going down and crowds going down. Sure.
I mean, obviously after the First World War, it still took 7 years for that rule change to come in. But David, as I was doing a bit of research on this, the Scottish FA seem to be quite keen for rule changes with the offside law. And I know, without going back too much after what you were saying there, Jonathan, the offside in own half, at one's own half law, they were quite keen to change that.
But that came in. That's an interesting point. And it's a point about this idea of playing football the right way. So that changes in 1906. And the reason is an England-Scotland game in April 1906, when England's left half, Harry Makepeace, gets injured. And the England captain, SS Harris of the Corinthians, who's an amateur player, and he comes, Corinthians obviously is coming from that university background. His response to that, and no substitutes obviously in those days, wasn't to pull back a forward, but it was to push forward the left back, Herbert Burgess, to play in midfield. And so what England do, and this seems ridiculous, they sit Robert Compton, the right back, they sit him deep. And the rest of the team plays what's essentially a pressing game. They play sort of 20, 25 yards from a Scottish goal. And Scotland keep on getting caught offside 25 yards from their own goal.
Yeah.
And this is seen as an absolute farce. There's newspaper articles, both north and south of the border, criticising Harris. Harris never plays for England again as a result of this. And then that summer they say, okay, you can only be offside in the opponent's half, to stop teams doing that. But I mean, that I think is an amazing sort of detail of how even 43 or 40 years after the offside law, as we in something like a recognisable form is brought in, people still hadn't worked out what you could do with it. And when somebody does exploit that, the sense isn't actually maybe this law's a bit daft. The sense is, well, that's a disgrace. He's not playing properly.
Yeah. Well, it was the one back game they used to call it. Or it was sort of tagged, which is quite funny.
From what I could tell, the Scots were a bit hesitant about the rule change, actually, because the passing game, short passing, was much more established north of the border than in England. I mean, Scotland were a much better team by and large at that time than England were. And there was a feeling, rightly or wrongly, that if you changed the offside law in this way, you'd get people just punting balls through the middle for quick forwards to run onto. And that was... the Scots were a lot more hesitant about that than the English were, but actually their season kicked off a week before the English season. I guess partly because the days were get shorter quicker there, and so I think that, again, as Jonathan was saying, there was one team, I think Kilmarnock or Hibernians, won 8-0 one week and then lost 5-0 the next. So there was one big swing. But they could tell from the first week or two of the Scottish season that although there were more goals, it wasn't ridiculous. You could still recognise the scorelines as scorelines in a football league.
Yeah, and some of the scorelines are quite interesting, as you say. Now, as I understand, Jonathan, in 1925, when the rule comes in, the FA arranged a trial match at Highbury.
Yeah,
where
and the first half it was played with the 2-man law, and the second half was they had a line 40 yards from goal at either end, and said you can only be offside beyond that, which doesn't seem like much given. I mean, it's only adding 10, 15 yards, but
it adds an extra layer of complication, though.
Yeah, and they trialled that and they decided they preferred the 2-man version, which is, I mean, on the one hand, I'm sort of inclined to give the FA credit for acknowledging here is a problem and thinking what might solutions be. Here are 2 possible solutions. Let's trial them. On the other hand, I sort of think 45 minutes is no time at all to make that sort of decision.
No.
But surely you trial it in a reserve league or something over the season.
Yeah, but when you know. I mean, clearly the proof is in the pudding. I mean,
well, and the fact is, it clearly was a very good change. I mean, we've only 100 years later, we've barely tweaked that law.
Exactly. Whereas in the previous, however many years, they really did try a bit of, backwards and forwards. And
I think it's worth saying, because you quite often see people talking about, is offside a dying law? Is it a law we should get rid of? Actually, offside's essential for the shape of football as we know it. And people say, well, you don't have it in hockey. Yeah, but hockey's a game where it's very, very difficult to play the ball in the air. And when it is played in the air, it has to be into space. You're not playing it for 2 players to jump for. If you had no offside law in football, then it would completely change the structure of the game, the shape of the game as we understand it. The offside law is absolutely essential for football as it stands. And the only thing you can do is you can occasionally tweak it, liberalise it, or, I don't think it's ever the intention, but the initial impact of VAR was to make it stricter again. And that sort of, it's almost like a valve where you're letting pressure in or letting pressure out or sort of creating pressure within the game. I think it's an incredibly useful tool for administrators to slightly change the pattern of a game without radically sort of ripping it up. So I think the offside law is a great law, and even though they made this change with next to no evidence, they somehow got it right.
Platini said, "Without offside, there's no football," didn't he? So he obviously.
I mean, Platini said a lot of things, but on this,
he did say a lot of things. But on
I happen to agree with him. Yeah.
Well, I don't think he was. I don't think he was paid for that opinion, David. So we'll let him. All right, less said about that, the better. Let's go for a quick break before I say something I regret. Welcome back to the Greatest Games on the Blizzard, everybody. So yes, you mentioned earlier, David, that it was the start of the season with that Aston Villa 10-0. And 160 goals on the opening day across the Football League at the start of this 25-26 season compared to 91 in the previous season. And on that particular match that we've highlighted, there was about 43,000 at Villa Park. Would there have been a sense of sort of wonderment among the crowd as to what this offside rule would bring? Did it sort of capture a bit of intrigue from the public, or were people just turning up to watch?
No, I mean, all the big newspapers did very prominent leaders on it. The Times described it as the bold experiment, no, the daring experiment, I think, right. and the Guardian talked about it being, this more important than anything that would be debated at the League of Nations or something like that. They definitely did.
Villa, the Guardian's tone has changed a lot about football.
I was about to say,
well,
get a bit about
Scott, wasn't
get
it?
that back. Yeah.
But Villa fans, I suspect, were probably less worried about the offside rule than the boardroom turmoil that was sweeping the club at the time. They 5 days before the first game, they'd lost the chairman who'd been there for a large number of years, Fred Rinder or Rinder. I don't know which it is. Tom Holland probably knows. He'd gone. So Villa was a team in considerable turmoil. I think the Holt end would have been probably very nervous about the first game of the season. Burnley weren't great. They narrowly avoided relegation the season before, but they had one or two very good players. John Hill ended the season as England's centre half, and this was a season where I'm sure we'll talk more later that the whole role of the centre half was almost continually under scrutiny. And they also had a young forward called Louis Page, who they insisted on playing on the wing the whole season. And then they moved him to centre forward in about March, about 3/4 of the way through the season, and he scored 6 in his first game. So Burnley were a funny old side, but the Villa fans certainly wouldn't have been expecting to win 10-0. I'm sure when dear old Len Capewell scored the first after I think it was 20 seconds, they'd have been absolutely delighted.
Well, especially given they finished 15th the previous season, which was their joint worst ever finish. I mean, Villa were they and Sunderland were the two great teams of the 1890s, and I don't know why you're rolling your eyes, Marcus.
Yeah, forgive me, everybody. Sorry.
And how different football might have been if Villa hadn't behaved despicably in the 1913 FA Cup final against Sunderland. But anyway, carry on.
It was a real sliding doors moment, we can agree. But yeah, Villa, you're right. They finished 15th. It was their joint lowest ever finish. And apparently the supporters were a bit disappointed. According to an article I found in the Birmingham Mail, the supporters back then were a bit disappointed with the selectors that they'd win their starting 11. They stuck with the old guard, and there's nothing like a 10-0 victory to get people back on the side, I find. But that should have kept them a bit happy when they went home that evening. It was incredible. Jonathan, how did it change football tactically then with this new rule implementation? Because that must have had huge shockwaves on the tactic boards around the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a realisation that once you lose the offside trap, you have to bolster the defence. So it appears that actually relatively early, the idea of dropping a centre-half deeper did happen in certain specific instances. So C.B. Fry wrote an encyclopedia entry in 1897 where he talks about the third back game. And he says if you're trying to defend Leeds with 20 minutes to go, pull your centre half deeper, play with essentially 3 fullbacks. Fullbacks in the sense of a player who plays right at the back rather than fullbacks as we understand today, and that will help you to hold the opposition at bay. So that idea has clearly been there. Herbert Chapman has experimented with it quite a lot. Chapman was not a good footballer, but he clearly had a very inventive, active brain. So even when he was a player. And he never played in the first division, never played at a high level. But he would wear very pale boots because he believed that allowed people to pick him out more easily. So when he finally gets to Arsenal, he brings in all these innovations. So he introduced the white sleeves because he had a theory that pale colours can be seen better in peripheral vision than dark colours. He introduced blue and white hooped socks for Arsenal just to make them brighter. So again, you could see them more easily with your heads down. And he did famously change the name of Gillespie Road Station to Arsenal. He installed floodlights. He experimented with numbers on the shirts. He was a very sort of thoughtful man. And again, even before 1925, he's begun to play with a third back at times. Most notoriously in the 1922 Cup final, which Huddersfield end up winning, but it's an incredibly boring game. And he's actually censured by the FA, which again, I think suggests this idea of you have to play the game the right way. Mm-hmm. And he's not censured because his team are physical or been committing fouls, just because he's been boring. Mm. But I mean, of course, he doesn't care. He's won the cup. And then he goes on to win the league with Huddersfield and then leaves after 2 successive titles to go to Arsenal because they offered him more money. And as he saw it, they offered greater potential for growth. And so he is one of the many who look at the changing offside law and think, right, the 3 at the back is the way we've got to go. But that then has a knock-on effect.
Well, yeah, because they brought in, or they changed the offside rule rather, because they felt that, as we mentioned in the first half, that football's getting a bit cagey and so on. But then this rule changes matters now, other than perhaps at Villa Park and 1 or 2 other results. As time goes on, you're saying that people then begin to start packing the defence.
Well, so Arsenal's first game that season, they beat Leeds 4-1. Mm-hmm. But not the first game. At the end of September, they beat Leeds 4-1, and then the following week they go to Newcastle and lose 7-0. Because there's still nobody sort of worked out what they're doing, and they just signed Charlie Buchan from Sunderland. Great inside forward, one of Sunderland's greatest ever players, and he'd famously been signed. Arsenal had offered £4,000, and Sunderland said no, we'll take £2,000 plus £100 for every goal he scores in his first season. And he ended up scoring 21. So Sunderland did get the better of that deal just. But Buchan, after this 7-0 defeat, says to Chapman, look, I'm just not going to go back to London. I'm going to retire. This is pointless. I can't cope with this. I'm going to stay up in the Northeast. I'm going to open a sports shop. And, I'm just rip up my contract. I don't want to play anymore. And Chapman has to talk him round and sort of says, well, what do you think we should do? And Buchan's idea is, well, as well as pulling back the centre half to become a third defender, we have to pull back with 2 inside forwards. So the default formation has been 2-3-5, the pyramid. You pull back the middle of the 3 to make a 3-2-5, but then you pull back the 2 inside forwards. So you got the wingers, the inside forwards, the centre forward. You pull back the 2 inside forwards to create a 3-2-2-3. And Buchan very much likes the idea because he's getting on a bit. His pace is beginning to go, of playing as that deep lying inside right. And Chapman doesn't think he can do it. Chapman doesn't want him to do it. He said, well, we'll do that, but you have to play centre forward. And Buchan's like, no, I'm doing that, or I'm staying up here and opening a sports shop. So Chapman gives in, and Buchan turns out to be absolutely brilliant at it, and goes on to score 21 goals.
And the birth of the WM formation was there.
Yeah.
And David, who were the other kind of, you mentioned Herbert Chapman, was there anyone else who particularly stood out around this time?
It turned out very well for a few forwards, because one of the other things that happened after a month or 2 was the speedsters in the team moved from the wing to the centre, because if you think about it, if you need to make sure both backs are between you and the opponent's goal when you start your run, you can only be sure to do that when you're on the wing, because that's the only place you can look across the line. If you're centre forward, you'd probably have one on either side of you, so it's guesswork whether or not you're going to be offside. As soon as you move to one defender and the goalkeeper is all you need between you, then the centre forward, it's possible for them to play on the defender's shoulder, and so they quickly cottoned onto this. At some teams, there was a guy called Frank Osborne, I think was South African, had a very successful season for Tottenham as one of these new breed fast centre forwards. And the other guy who comes to mind, Dixie Dean, timed his arrival in the game just right. This was his first season. He started off in the Everton reserves. Well, his first season for Everton anyway. Started off in the Everton reserves, I think it was beginning of September, quite early in the season, he scored 7 in a 10-0 win over Bradford City reserves, and spent the rest of the season in the first team. So it would have made his life easier, that's for sure. Also, Hughie Gallagher arrived in England from Adrianians, went to play for Newcastle. And it kind of suited him, this new style. And some of the other Huddersfield, it's interesting at how few changes in, the good teams ended up remaining good in spite of the law change, in spite of this fairly fundamental law change. Huddersfield, they were the reigning champions. They won the league title again, even though in spite of the rule change, in spite of the fact that Chapman had just gone to Arsenal. And they adapted as well. They had a very good Scottish winger called Alex Jackson, and he spent a lot of time until they signed another Scottish centre forward from Cowdenbeath. Jackson spent a lot of time playing centre forward, and also his runs on the wing became much more diagonal. There was another, he'd make much more of an effort to sort of come in on the far post crosses than under the old system. The top scorer in the year, with 43 goals in what would then have been 42 games, was a guy called Ted Harper for Blackburn Rovers, who I don't know a lot about him. He doesn't seem to have pulled up many trees other than in this season. He got selected for the England-Scotland game and didn't score, didn't play particularly well. Never got signed. Never got capped again. So I think probably Dean and Gallagher are the two who really became stars during the season. There was another thing that happened, was that the Jonathan's right about this, the centre halves being pulled back, but teams and individual players were quite reticent about that. A lot of them, having spent their entire careers being creative as well as defensive players, in fact, probably primarily creative players, they didn't want to change their game completely like that. So they try and do both. And there are quite a few tall, 6 foot was very tall in those days, and quite a few of the centre halves by the end of that season were 6-footers. There was a guy called Harry Skitt, who for Tottenham, who I don't think had a very long career at the top because he got injured, but he had a very good season in 25-26. Both cup finalists, Bolton and Man City. There was a guy called Jimmy Seddon for Bolton, another very tall guy, and Sam Cowan from Manchester City I think he was just under 6 foot, but he was a well-built individual. So the role of centre half really changed, and there was a lot of onus on the sort of physicality. Hill, the Burnley player we talked about earlier, he was and remained a sort of all-action player, but again, he was 6'2". He was one of the ones who tried to keep the attacking side of his game going, but I think Burnley, I'm right in saying, are one of the 3 or 4 teams who conceded over 100 goals that year. So I'm not sure whether you can say it worked.
Not too commanding, maybe.
Yeah, we should say as well, to be fair to Jack Hill, that he got injured in this game against Villa.
He did get injured,
collided with George Stevenson, had to be carried off, covered in blood, had to have stitches. And that's probably one of the reasons why Villa were able to score 10.
That's undoubtedly one. It was 2-0 by that point when he was carried off, but 10-0. It probably.
But this point about the role of a centre half changing, I mean, you see that very specifically at Arsenal, who had Jack Butler as a centre half, who was a very sort of elegant, cultured player, and Chapman sort of realised, no, it's not what we need. So he went to Oswestry and signed Herbie Roberts, who people thought was just a lump. And so the term that Chapman used was, I need my centre half to be an overcoat. That he was just an overcoat who hung over the shoulders of the opposing centre forward. And this is and I think this sets a template for English centre halves I mean, for all time, essentially. And, we're still slightly suspicious of the ball playing centre half. Maybe not so much now, but even 20 years ago, we were. If you think of the reaction to, say, Rio Ferdinand when he first emerged, it was, well, we're not quite certain about that kind of thing. But this is where I think British football or English football diverges from continental European football. That certainly in Austria, Hungary, Italy, there's still a belief that now the centre half, okay, we're going to pull him slightly deeper, but he's going to retain some of his creative qualities. But then, having said that, this is still very different to South America. So when Doi Kushner, great Hungarian coach, when he goes to Flamengo in 1936, the centre half there is Fausto dos Santos, who is sort of a huge star of the team. And he says to him, no, you're going to have to play a bit deeper because we're introducing sort of Central European tactics. We're going to go from this crazily attacking 2-3-5 to not quite a WM, but sort of a WW. And Dos Santos is having none of it. He refuses to do it until the club president literally threatens to sack him. And this is the beginning of the real revolution in Brazilian football that makes them the great power they become, certainly by the end of the 50s. So I think this move is of introducing the third back is critical to how football is played, but how you interpret that role of the third back is critical to the style of football that you play.
And David, going back to the media reaction, you see some bombastic headlines from our friends at The Guardian and one or two others, as you said at the time. What then was the media reaction as the results started to come in and the performances and the changing of these tactics?
I think within a month, pretty much everybody had accepted that the law was a good thing and that it was there to stay.
Quite remarkable in football. It just took a month for people.
It wasn't much more.
I don't think it. I mean, you're right in terms of the sort of general, match-going reporters, but you have Willy Meisel, who even in 1954, his book Soccer Revolution comes out. Willy Meisel was an Austrian Jew who moves to England in the 30s because of anti-Semitism back in Austria. He's the brother of Hugo Meisel, the great head of the Austrian FA and Austrian national team manager. And even as late as 1954, he's saying football went wrong when it changed the offside law in 1925. We should have trusted people to do the right thing. And you think, hang on, you grew up in like Nazi Vienna. Why would you trust people to do the right thing? Like, it makes no sense at all.
I thought you were going to say he started saying, "Well, that third goal back in the day, that wouldn't have counted." You know,
I don't know. I think it was a really entertaining season because it was a season of a lot of experimentation and not all the experiments went right. There were quite a few teams decided, having initially turned against playing the offside trap, the one back ploy. Quite a few teams tried to go back to it, including Arsenal. Actually, started playing offside a lot in the first half of the season before doing that tweak that Jonathan explained with Charlie Buchan. But one of the Manchester United suddenly decided to switch tactics and try and play an offside trap with just one back for the Manchester derby against City, and it was absolutely disastrous. They lost 6-1 at home. And there were quite a few funny results like that. There was one. I think the most remarkable swing was in October when it was still relatively new. Manchester City, who had a heck of a season, they ended up getting relegated, but also reached the cup final. They beat Burnley 8-3, and then 2 days later they went to Sheffield and lost to Sheffield United by the same score. And they also had a phenomenal cup run. I think they played Crystal Palace, who were Division 2 or possibly even Division 3 South at the time, in the fourth round. And Manchester City won 11-4, And the Palace goalkeeper played so well that he was carried off the field by the Palace fans afterwards.
Fantastic. Oh, that's superb.
But I think there's sort of a wider point here about the experimentation, which is that English football, certainly up to the First World War, had been very, very conservative.
Mm.
And once 2-3-5 becomes sort of bedded in around about 1880, I mean, there's evidence that Cambridge University played in the 1870s, Nottingham Forest in the 1870s. We know that Wrexham used it in the 1878 Welsh Cup final. But essentially from 1880-ish onwards, everybody plays 2-3-5 and you don't question it. And suddenly you get, in those years immediately after the war, and then particularly after the change in the offside law, you get this experimentation. And people, I think, for the first time, are really thinking about the game tactically. I think it forced that mentality.
Yeah.
And what's interesting then is, once the WM is bedded in by sort of the early 30s, because the marking structure is very, very straightforward in WM, that it's a symmetrical formation with the same number of defenders as forwards. So the right back picks up the left winger, the right half picks up the inside left. Yeah. It's very straightforward. Nobody thinks to change it. The British football goes back into this conservatism, which is why it's so vulnerable when zonal marking starts in the beginning of the 50s and you get suddenly Hungary turning up at Wembley and beating them 6-3, because Hungary's players move. They don't just stay where they're meant to stay. So this is this sort of brief period, and I think you can date it from 1918, say, to 1930, 31, of English football really waking up to the possibilities and being prepared to try things, and some of them worked and some of them didn't. But at least there's an imagination there, which then just disappears for another 20 years.
Yeah. Well, why do you think that was? I mean, I don't want to get too sidetracked, of course. But
why do I think they slipped back into conservatism?
Yes.
I think England is fundamentally quite conservative. There's a sense that you do the thing that works, and why would you change it? And Arsenal become hugely successful in the 30s. They're the first Southern team to win the league when they win it in 31. They win 3 league titles in a row. Chapman dies midway through the second one, so it's the second of his clubs that win 3 in a row. Although he's not there at the end, either Huddersfield or Arsenal. But Arsenal go on to be the dominant side. They win the league again later in the decade. They win the cup again. So I guess they're the template, and everybody sort of wants to follow them. And then, of course, you have the war. And I guess once you get the reset after the war, people are just sort of feeling their way back into what they'd already been doing. And nobody was watching football abroad. So England would play. England went to cheer in 1948 and hammered Italy, who were the double world champions then, 34 and 38. There hadn't been a World Cup after that till 50. And so that's sort of proof the English way is the right way. And also, the WM relies for creativity on great wingers, and that was a period when England had great wingers. They had Matthews and they had Finney. It also demands clever, incisive inside forwards, and you had people like Mortensen and Mannion and Shackleton. So they had really great, very popular players who fitted those roles. So why would you change a system the two things go hand in hand. Those players develop because the system is there, but you keep the system because it fits the players. So I think it's very easy to see why it just sort of you keep going on with the same pattern. Whereas Hungarian football has a very different mindset that the coffee house intellectuals who'd taken on Hungarian football were always thinking. They always wanted to tweak. Their whole thing was, I want to think of something new. And that just didn't exist in the English game. Or when Brazil suddenly changed, it's because they start from a really low base. Krushnam arrives with this idea, and suddenly it's like, oh, hang on, everything we knew before was nonsense. This is the way you do it. And then people keep thinking and building on that. So, it's...
Also, this experimentation, because of the offside law, I mean, it was forced by a new law, right? It wasn't like they were necessarily.
I mean, that's true, but also the law is forced by the experimentation with the offside trap. So the two do go hand in hand,
right? Yes, yeah.
Well,
but that itself, I mean, you're right. That itself is forced by the war, and so new people in positions of power and new a new mentality of how you approach the game. So I guess you can say it is the First World War which causes it. Well, and I suppose if you want to sort of extend that into wider culture, why do you get modernism in the 20s? Why do people start ripping up the old ways of doing things? Because we've seen what they lead to.
We've seen what they lead to.
And so the whole Ezra Pound's make it new. It's exactly the same impetus in football as in poetry, as in other forms of literature, as in painting, as in sculpture, as in whatever.
But a good idea lasts, David. And as Jonathan said earlier on, there's been sort of minor tweaks to the offside rule, but really
that's pretty much what we've got. That's right.
Yeah, which is quite extraordinary. It's lasted the test of
but
time.
I think it is worth saying that when it does change again, so there is a liberalisation post 1990 World Cup as part of a raft of changes to try and make the game more attacking. So it's the same issue that by 1990 the game's become a bit staid, a dearth of goals, worries about attendance is falling. I mean, attendance is obviously falling largely in Britain because of hooliganism as much as because of the product. But the result of that change in the offside law, which initially is to say that level is onside, whereas previously it had been offside, and then to change the definition of what it is to interfere. So you get far fewer offside decisions. So I think in the Premier League between 1998 and 2008, the number of offside decisions drops by 38%. And that's happening across Europe. And the result of that, the impact of that, is defences sit slightly deeper, and that increases the effective playing area, which means you can have these smaller, more technical players, which is what facilitates Barcelona. And so you probably wouldn't have had Barcelona playing the way they did under Guardiola had you not had the change in the offside law as a result of the 1990 World Cup. So the offside law is still an absolutely critical law to governing how we play, even though that tweak post 1990 is relatively minor compared to what happened in 1925.
Unfortunately, VAR has made it very clear what the offside rule is, and no one complains anymore about it. I should point out as well, everybody, that obviously we mentioned Villa beating Burnley 10-0. 4 years later, in 1929, Sheffield United beat Burnley 10-0, which equalled their worst defeat in the league. So clearly they didn't learn. But there we are. Sean Dyche wasn't in charge. So
and we should give credit to Len Capewell, who scored 5, and Billy Walker, who got a hat-trick.
Yeah,
and Stevenson and York got the other 2 goals.
It's interesting. I think
wrap that up, for people who actually came to this thinking we're going to go into depth,
just in case the Capewell estate.
I think Capewell only scored 9 in the entire previous season, so he obviously liked the law change.
Yeah, him and Herbert Chapman benefited greatly. David, it's been a pleasure talking to you about this. Thanks very much for coming on the pod.
Pleasure, Marcus. Thanks.
For more stories like that, do check out theblizzard.co.uk. Myself and Jonathan will be back next week with another great game from the history of football. See you then.